Welcome to the 14th Perkins lecture. Today is a good day for ceramic art at Alfred. The Alfred Ceramic Art Museum's exhibition, Old Pioneers, opens in our gallery in Binsmara Hall directly after this talk. And if you were as lucky as I am, you heard art history professor Megan Jones's talk at the Bergen Forum on Japanese ceramics. She's making me fall in love with Japanese ceramics all over again. Back to my start in this world in the 70s. But I want to say something to you about the Perkins lecture. The Dorothy Wilkins Perkins lecture series was established by Lyle Perkins, BFA Alfred, 1939, MFA, 1947. He established the series in honor of his wife, Dorothy, BFA, 1939. Ceramic artists and campus sweethearts. They were married at the campus chapel in 1940. They both gained significant reputations as ceramic artists, and as a team, they had a formative impact on the education of ceramic artists through their pioneering work at the Rhode Island School of Design, Ohio State University, and the University of Massachusetts. They were pioneers. We are gathered here this afternoon to launch the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum's exhibition, Old Pioneers. But before I introduce Dr. Ezra Shales, the exhibition's mastermind, I want to take a minute to thank the Old Pioneers team. First and foremost, I want to thank Susan Walton, the museum's curator of collections, sitting way back there. The Sun newspaper, in their article about the Old Pioneers, mentions that she coordinated the exhibition. If I had the time to explain what that means to you, you would be amazed. She is a definition of a professional, and her work, as well as her devotion to the museum, is of major significance. Thank you, Susan. Thanks to Rick McClay, who designed the Old Pioneers catalog, I have worked with him on many projects. Not only is he good at what he does, he's fun and easy to work with. A winning combination for sure. And speaking of the catalog, we had many scholars who made contributions to that document. It's a very important document, I believe, full of great information and good scholarship. And one of those scholars from Museum of Art in Boston, Carolyn Paul, is here with us in the front row. Do you want to stand and just say hello? Thank you for being here. It's great. I also want to thank the Division of Ceramic Art for the faculty support of the catalog, and to the Dean of the School of Art and Design for his support related to the behind-the-scenes logistics of the exhibition. An additional thank you to our new administrative assistant, Jack of all trades, Caitlin Brown. Behind the scenes, I'm sure. And to our student crew, Bryce Lloyd and Victoria Pugh, who helped to make the installation of the exhibition a reality. So, now to Dr. Shales. It is my pleasure. I am happy. It is my honor. The first words of a typical introduction are a little innocuous, pro forma and feeble when it comes to introducing someone like Ezra. But yes, without question, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Ezra Shales. BA Wesleyan University, MFA Hunter College, Ph.D. Bard Graduate School, Center for Studies in Decorative Arts, Design and Culture, the 2010 recipient of the Joseph Prusen Award for Excellence in Teaching, Alfred University, and currently Associate Professor at the Mass College of Art and Design. Many of you know him because he was, until just recently, part of the Alfred School family. Ezra is an art historian with a particular interest in the intersection of art, craft, and design, and this makes him a special friend to the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum. His scholarship is admired across a wide spectrum of the art community. Scholars, critics, artists, collectors, and all students of America's craft and design evolution since the 19th century are turning to Ezra for insight. Scholar and museum consultant Ellen Denker writes about Ezra's book, Made in New Jersey, for the Journal of Modern Craft. These words should provoke our interest and perhaps our concern. In his book, Shales brings Newark back to the life it led at the dawn of the 20th century as the region's hotbed of invention. There were at one time so many clever artisans in Newark with minds and hands employed in discovering the solutions to myriad problems of design and mechanics that manufacturers vied for their expertise. Today, Newark has been all but forgotten in the shadows of New York City. Its reputation salvaged, perhaps, only by its famous museum. As he dissects the work of a city fully engaged in commerce and industry, Shales helps us remember the cultural importance of making, whether in a factory, a workshop, or a library museum. Today's lectures, Pioneers of American Ceramics, is associated with the exhibition Ezra curated for our museum entitled Oh, Pioneers, Women Ceramic Artists, 1925 to 1960. The title echoes Willa Cather's famous novel, Oh, Pioneers. In his essay for the catalog, Ezra quotes the following words from her novel. These words grew and magnified in me as I read them. Cather writes, a pioneer should have imagination, should be able to enjoy the idea of things more than the things themselves. Ezra's excellent essay in the catalog, O Pioneers, opens our eyes to the fundamental structural role women ceramic artists played in giving vital nourishment to the growth of American ceramic art, and to the ideas as well as the ideals it embodies. We know little about their accomplishments. Ezra and the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum mean to change that. Please join me in welcoming back to Alfred University, Professor Ezra Shales.
I know it's very boring to have someone thank the people who were just thanked and to thank the person who was just introduced you, and it sounds kind of...
We're happy to hear all the things.
We're all... I'm very honored to be here. It was really a great part of being here to introduce previous lecturers. This lecture probably won't stand out except in one way, which is that I'm probably the only Perkins lecturer who has seen a Dorothy Perkins pot. But that isn't really much of a boast in a sense, because I had to kind of, I failed in the end to get a Dorothy Perkins pot in the show. I'll admit that failure. And that wasn't for want of trying. But she is in there on the ornament label, a cover of hers that she did for Ceramics Monthly. But this work was kind of great to do. I really do thank Susan Kowalczyk for inviting me. It's really her enthusiasm for the project that made me do it. I know you might think that might be ambition, but it's really more the idea that you have able collaborators and excited collaborators like Wayne and Susan. Being here was great in terms of working with the Department of Ceramic Art. The whole kind of fabric of Alfred's history was really special to kind of decenter me from my own sense of historical narrative. So it was very special, and in many ways this project is for me a total gift to to receive the chance to do, because it pulls together every collaborator I met at conferences that the college sponsored me to go see, so I thank you for this opportunity. I also thank Bryce and Caitlin and Victoria for their installation and bearing with me as I change things. Tonight's lecture was going to be a rehashing of what's in the catalog, and then I thought I should do more. But I do feel I have to introduce the catalog. The document on the left is the work of Elizabeth Gulashi, and really got me working on this. Hope everyone's retinas are okay. Working on this project, and it's interesting. Retrieving a person who, for whom a gallery is named, and yet with whom no one can associate a visual image, is interesting. The project was initially about Fosdick and Clara Nelson, and Marion Fosdick and Clara Nelson, and it changed, it morphed over time. And it also, I'll weave this in, it grew into another project, and then I've been juggling two projects over the last couple of years. But it really is rooted in conversations and in archival work that were started here. The pots on the right were sent by Marion Fosdick to the 1939 World's Fair. And when she went there to go find them, she found them filled with sand outside the men's and women's laboratories, being used as ashtrays. And she told this story to Herb Cohen and Val Cushing and Marty Chodos when they were students here. And the fact that she kind of recounted this, the story I thought was very moving. She's a hard person to retrieve, and yet she grew up in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. She journeyed to Berlin to study there. She was a worldly woman. She attended the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She traveled extensively. Her father was an extremely successful engineer, working with the railroads and steam fitting operations. But she's hard to retrieve, and she left little documentation. So to actually identify these large vases in Alfred's collection, it came about through a conversation with Herb Cohen, 80-something years old, and sending him pictures and having him actually read that visual prompt and hold on to his memory. So it's quite astonishing. And the memories these students had of eating cornmeal cakes baked in the shape of corn in kind of cast iron forms, and having hot chocolate with Fosdick and Nelson was quite moving, that they held on to these as critical moments when they learned what it was like to become an artist or to be an artist. So this is in some ways the story of Fosdick. I worked on a previous exhibition here at Alfred called Raw Goods with the tireless and incredible Ann Currier. And it was when I was working with Ann that I realized that Ann Currier was the first full-time studio faculty hired since Fosdick retired in 1955, and when Ann was hired in 1985. And that might seem like a minor fact, but it was interesting because as I looked at it, Maya Grotel's position has never been filled by a woman since she retired. And that was true of RISD, and that was true of several other places too. So it became a kind of salient fact that, that while we celebrate the GI Bill and wonderful and incredible people that it allowed to rise up in the world, you know, the sons of grocers became Supreme Court justices for the first time in this country on the GI Bill. However, the wave of, in the Art Academy, there was a wave of men that supplanted all of these women in these jobs. So that's a little bit of the backstory in terms of how I kind of fell in with Marion Fosdick. If you've ever worked late in Alfred too, and walked home on a cold enough night so that the snowflakes gather on your eyelashes, you can also enjoy that. I loved reading her stories about being so enchanted by the fact that this town still had gas lighting in 1921 on its street lamps instead of electricity, where she was from a more, you know, urbane neighborhood previously. So it's interesting to pull her back into the present. I hope for you that she is not dated, that she can spring to life. But it's about the pots very much breathing and taking them seriously. In many ways, several people have asked me why I'm retrieving these people from the past. People like Fosdick or people like Augusta Savage. And here you can see this is a wonderful image that is not in the catalog because I don't have the right to reproduce it, but it's the 10-year-old boy artist-to-be Romare Bearden photographed his mother in front of Augusta Savage's sculpture at the World's Fair. I'm not retrieving people who were unknown. This is an interesting feminist project in a sense because it has no agenda to be subversive or to reverse, you know, the hierarchy of who's important. In many ways, I'm simply shining a light on who was important at the time, once. Augusta Savage's sculpture here was not reproduced in bronze, unfortunately, and so it has been lost to time. We are lucky in some ways to have Marion Fosdick's works preserved here in Alfred because she taught here. Two other works that really triggered for me or revealed or documented Marion Fosdick's importance was the fact that Maya Grotel, somewhat of a household name in ceramic history, certainly not outside of ceramic history, unfortunately. Her work, as well as Marion Fosdick's, these two pieces, were purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1940. This is from the Syracuse National Traveling Exhibition, and so two of the three works of the time that were purchased were by women. And that's interesting to document, to think back on, and to look at. Fosdick's work is amply documented in the show. We have this lovely Grotel. Here is Grotel holding one of her pots. One of the few photographs, I think, that shows a powerful woman, and I'll get back to that in a minute. And here the two are together. I'm going to run through some of this because I'm interested in, for the sake of time, getting to Q&A and everything else. Dina Kuhn, her work, Das Wasser, is in the Everson now. They only acquired it late in the game, but this actually toured through America in the 1920s as part of an international ceramic art exhibition. There are three versions of this, at least, or four known. One's in the Cleveland Museum of Art. There were lots of influences at the time, kind of gestating in American ceramics. There was a lot of cross-pollination. And what was interesting to me in this exhibition was to pull out Fosdick, but also look at the really broad picture of international forces on ceramics. Megan Jones worked on one of the SS who contributed to that kind of international perspective, looking at Janet Leach. But what was also important was to reintegrate Native American work within the main story. Too often, this is kind of separated and categorized as an alternative or a separate story. And if you read the catalog, you'll see that in 1940, and perhaps not since, people like Maria Martinez and Maya Grotel, born in Helsinki, Finland, and Marion Fosdick were all seen as American ceramics, which is an interesting juggling act, and one which we should try and do again. Salvaging people at times was literally salvaging them, like this is how I found the root brick piece that's in the exhibition now in the Everson Museum. No one could find it initially, and then it was over someone's desk. But I love this. I hope that person enjoyed it as much as I do. There's an installation in the exhibition of root brick that is a bit heavy-handed by yours truly, in which I've actually printed out several root bricks on canvas and hung them with them. That's because there is a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy that I tried to track down, which shows either the artist studio with a dozen of these ceramic pieces hung together on the wall, or the artist's intention, which was to kind of put together an installation. So to see these objects as static or as cut off from their greater context is problematic. Root brick is certainly not a household name. Her husband was Tapio Virkkala, an extremely famous and extremely renowned designer. And it's remarkable that she's in the Everson's collection. She's not many other places in America, but she exhibited in New York City regularly in the 50s and 60s. So she's someone we should have on our screen. This exhibition, it very much connects to another exhibition I said, and here it is, Pathmakers, which I organized at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City, and opened in April. It'll close in, I think, maybe it closed last week, maybe it closes in 2 weeks, and it'll travel to the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and be there through the spring. Here you see some Edith Heath work, and I'll get back to that in a bit. This exhibition was somewhat similar. It was born to be historical, and then it morphed and became about today as well as the past. Unfortunately, really for me, as Marion Fosdick, as the likelihood of Marion Fosdick being part of this exhibition diminished, I became more and more committed to this exhibition happening in order to make sure that I paid my respects to Marion Fosdick. Tonight, I thought I would make my life a little harder or do a little more work and earn my pay. And also I thought I would pull the exhibition into tighter focus so that you really have 3 biographies that we could juggle instead of a multitude of names and instead of the kind of broad range that's in O Pioneers. So here are the 3 on whom I'm going to focus for the rest of my lecture. This is really a lecture proper in a sense. Recently someone asked me to write about, to talk about the wheel and the role of the wheel, the potter's wheel, in American art, American culture. And this is a kind of the story that I came up with to think through how we think about the wheel. Edith Heath is really thought of these days as California good design, and she's in the Museum of Modern Art. Karen Karnes is really celebrated as a virtuosic production potter, and Toshiko Takaezu is largely praised for achieving a kind of a Zen grace, I'd say, in ceramic sculpture. But in some ways, they really inhabit 3 different terrains of design, art, and craft. And they have their admirers are in those different fields. And yet, they all use the wheel. they all were committed to ceramics in this incredible way for an entire lifetime. And I thought in some ways they epitomize one of the stories we can tell in O Pioneers, which they're all represented, as well as American ceramics or American culture in general. Because this questions the way we tell the story of art and the way we tell who makes it. The wheel, the potter's wheel in particular, is often seen as a traditional tool and not in relationship to innovation, or even worse, I'd say, not in relationship to intellectually difficult work. And really here my question is our perception written in embedded in the tool? In what? The entire edifice of appreciation for modern ceramics, and this was recently reinforced by an exhibition that opened this week, or next week, at Yale University, is that Peter Volkos in particular, and West Coast ceramics especially, departed from the tradition of the wheel, broke the wheel in a sense. This was not Volkos's own view, well, depending on his temperament and temperature, which ran in different directions, but it was his critical reception, and it maintains that view, even so recently as the last year, people writing that Volkos discarded tradition. The real problem, I think, with seeing these women as part of that fluorescence of change or cultural turmoil or of achievement in artistic expression is that these were women and that they also engaged in this artwork as a discipline in some ways, not as a bacchanal. And also that they remained wedded to the potter's wheel, in a sense, as a way of making work. And that's true, I'll say this again, of Edith Heath, too, who always prototyped objects on the wheel, even if lots of what you'll see out there is jiggered or made in molds. So how can we see them as avant-garde is the question of this talk, in a sense. Although recent attention on mid and late 20th century ceramics is still on the increase, few women have made it into the spotlight. And I think in next year or the next year after, there's going to be a Volkos monographic study by a museum, as if that's really necessary. If we continue to celebrate Volkos' abstract expressionist ceramics as a bold rupture, I hope to suggest a kind of wider bandwidth in which you can see more subtle disturbances or ruptures, especially between notions of social forms and permissive play. This disparity between etiquette, right, and kind of the threat of violence as an alternative. Their work is too broad to include in the show in all its forms. In particular, I'd say Heath's work is enormous and is not just table-based. These artists were definitely innovative. Toshiko Takaezu, at the end of her life, made these massive forms, the Star series, life-size, bigger than her, for certainly. And here they are at the RAM, the Racine Art Museum. And if you watch the Rose Bowl, you might have seen these. Here's the Pasadena Art Museum from 1969, a Ladd and Kelsey exterior with 100,000 tiles by Edith Heath on them. The biographical portraits we have of these potters, I'd say too often suggest they're like Vermeer's lace maker, that they're quietly content, reiterating convention. Whereas I'd like to say that this image suggests that they are kind of losing themselves in the manual process. Let's step back and say, maybe in fact they are shaking the idea of decorum or the idea of social etiquette. Maybe they're not maintaining propriety in this mild-mannered, quiet, and contented way that Vermeer depicts. Maybe they are making unruly domestic objects. 3 generations of critics have sanctified him and even misspelled his name in publication. Saying Volkos's works are about violation, violence, and volcanic. And really, I'm trying to pull back from this sanctification of, he looks like a Guido Reni portrait here, Saint Volkos, and also trying to think when did he do what he did? In the 1951 Ceramic National, I love the fact that he submitted a popcorn bowl. Somehow that's amazing, very American. Among his other objects, but his work was like this, and yet we see him as breaking convention. One of the great objects in the exhibition is this Anne Chapman horse. Here it was at the Everson when I found it, next to a Volkos, really kind of fittingly actually, because they both have these wonderful Indian paisley decorations on them. That's just when Museum of Modern Art is having images of a celebration of India on the whole ground floor, transformed into a bazaar with 3 dozen mannequins wearing saris. Chapman's horse is really brought to life and allowed to sing in this exhibition, as is Volkos's teacher, who's really not well known, but Peter Volkos and Rudy Audio both studied with Frances Zenska. And there you see her jug in the background, and the relationship between the two is a visual pleasure for me, as well as a chance for these to breathe again and gain new meanings. To start with Karnes, of the 3, Karnes is known as this virtuosic potter, but the interesting thing is that if you go back and look at what she was first achieving, she won an award for a hand-built pot like this. It's recently been exhibited as sculpture a couple of years ago, and I love the fact when I went back that this was not just a double vase, as people call it, but it was a double vase with candlestick holders. There's a sense in which this really pulls you back to thinking of this as an object that's part of a decorum of a different era. If those little weird ghost-like nubs are for candles instead of being hollow. The Karnes object, and then the Lisa McVeigh piece, ceramic form, that Caroline Cole wrote about, who's here, in her essay, were very importantly exhibited as pottery. And we usually today, in recent exhibitions, celebrate them as sculpture, or forget that, or don't acknowledge the fact that they were put so much out there as pottery. Karnes made many things on the wheel, and she's going to always be known for casseroles. We have one in the exhibition. For the Museum of Arts and Design, I was really glad to retrieve this object, a set of 2 stools that she made. This is what I mean by an unruly domestic object. It is obviously coiled, and this to me is something very interesting. If you actually ever try to sustain and preserve coils like this, it's quite tricky. And so she's taken this kind of novice's skill and elevated it in this kind of strange, weird way. I don't know if these are kind of geological strata. I don't know if they relate to intestines, but they are very odd objects that I find very compelling. And to pull out the story of her life, I found them even more compelling because when her husband walked out on her, she left her and their child to live alone, and she immediately began making these much more social objects, I think, these stools. And she made them up until she found her next partner, Anne Stannard. So for this 12-year period, she was making these pairs of stools, which are very social, and yet very awkward, I'd say. They might go inside, they might go outside. They epitomize this notion of living outdoors and having the indoors and outdoors bleed together. They're not just irrelevant objects, though, or side peripheral objects that she made. They were exhibited in Objects of the USA. When she was 47, she was celebrated at that time as a virtuosic potter. But these are the two stools, in fact, that I found deaccessioned and sitting in a Chicago gallery, which we then got the museum to reacquire. And they have this incredible provenance as well. She exhibited them at the Milan Triennale and won a Pomodoro, a gold leaf, for them. And here they are in this very strange space designed by Charles Forberg of stretched nylon, where she not only exhibited a hearth with these stools, and the double stool really is quite magnificent, as well as bird feeders. And here's a wonderful cover I just found this summer, Saturday Evening Post, showing this kind of high-tech primitivism in some strange way, that the chairs epitomize leisure, but leisure for a kind of a technologically modern moment. One of the organizers of the fair was Jack Lenore Larson. He also acquired these stools for his home. They inhabited and kind of collaborated with his pseudo-appropriation of a Bantu house built of concrete blocks. I had the pleasure of visiting these and seeing them. And so they could be part of Jack Lenore Larson's stage set of kind of Long Island's version of Africa. And then they could also migrate elsewhere. And I suppose, to be honest, when I look at this image of the Noguchi Museum, this is where I first discovered them, and maybe this is my strong affection for them, or explains that, which is that Karnes' stool was the only object in the Noguchi Museum that was not made by Noguchi when I went there when I was 18 or something. But I had no idea. I just enjoyed sitting on it. Just to show you these different meanings, it could go from the Milan Triennale to Jack Lenore Larson's meaning to Noguchi's meaning, where it related much more to biomorphic abstraction. And it could sustain all of these different readings and interpretations because it was part of all of these different ideas of the time. So to retrieve Karnes and say, no, she's not just a virtuosic potter, but she's able to upend the wheel when she wants to, is fascinating. In the exhibition, we have two objects brought together, Karen Karnes and Toshiko Takaezu, and you can see these two teapots they made, where they really engaged in the exercise of throwing, but in the exercise of throwing and then altering and thinking through. So they're throwing these pots and then throwing them on their side, right? And there's a kind of a visual similarity there, which suggests, kind of intellectual sympathies and a similar kind of calisthenics going on, not just in the hand but in the mind, in terms of what can I make that undoes what the wheel does, that sends the sense of physical gravity elsewhere. Takaezu is fascinating because if you look at mid-century craft and the way it dealt with modernism, she really decides around 1960 she's no longer going to be seen as a potter, but she's going to be an artist, and she no longer calls what she makes pots, she calls them forms. And this is a kind of new aesthetic idea perhaps, but it really is a new idea of changing your professional alignment as well. Here's what she exhibits at the first Ceramic National. I don't know if this is a popcorn bowl or just a large, very large bowl. Someone can tell me later, a real connoisseur. Here is the work that she's making when she's just graduated from Cranbrook and she's living in Cleveland. She says perhaps these two spouted forms were inspired by pre-Columbian pottery, but I certainly did not copy them. I do not make a teapot and say this is for use. Form is my first concern. Takaezu is an interesting story because she also really brings this question of cultural heritage into the picture and how we characterize her. she's been characterized as a Japanese potter almost since she began to exhibit at the Potter's Guild in Honolulu, but also in Cleveland. She was even recently called a Japanese American potter 2 years ago by a museum. But she is really a Japanese American Hawaiian. She is explained too often, I think, in terms of her ethnicity and kind of pigeonholed that way. Even if she is from Hawaii, she studies there. She works at a factory first. She studies with someone who's an Ohio State graduate. And when she goes to Cranbrook, she's a mature student. When she meets Saarinen, who's written this book, The Search for Form. And then when she meets people like Lenore Tawney after moving to the East Coast, where Tawney's exhibiting her woven forms, Takaezu takes this on as a kind of idea right in that year, 1963. Their friendship extended to weaving together. Takaezu also made flossa, ria, Scandinavian rugs after her Cranbrook experience. So I think to call her or characterize her as a Japanese potter is troubling. It troubled her, but she was pretty austere and kind of let it go. She had 2 brothers who served in the American military. And when she relocated to Clinton, New Jersey, the farmer whose home she wanted to buy refused to sell it to her because she was Japanese in his eyes. But she had the nerve to give the money to someone else and have them purchase the home for her and live next to the farmer thereafter without any worry. So here's her work. She does make what's known as the closed form, or closing the throne form. This, in some ways, is how she strays from ceramic convention, you could argue, but you could also argue that closed forms go back centuries, and that is not in itself unique. Here is the ensemble of Takaezu's, including a garden stool that we assembled at the Museum of Arts and Design to tell her story in Pathmakers. In Objects USA, her work is described as delicate. And it's very interesting to me that of the people who are exhibited in Objects USA, only women's objects and women's art was described as intimate or delicate. Even Richard DeVore or Ruby Staffel, whose work could have equally been seen as such. So only women, and specifically Karnes and Takaezu, are characterized in that way. Or Takaezu was described as in reference to the Hawaiian landscape repeatedly. So tonight I want to think about one other way we can look at Takaezu. Hopefully this will work. So many of you won't have the chance to do that. I'm very lucky to have had the opportunity to do that. And what I think it means, in a sense, is it's not happenstance. These are actual rattles or devices that she began to include in her pots regularly to produce these sounds. In many ways, the sound does this very strange thing. It really, it's kind of almost a premonition of mortality. It sounds like you're going to break something. It sounds like you're going to crack something. It has that gritty feeling. It's not a kind of warm or cuddly sensation of a sound. It also, I think, defines the interior space in a kind of interesting way. And if Karnes, I'm suggesting, drifted away from the wheel and did innovate in relationship to hand building and making those strange garden stools, I think we can see this as an interesting innovation by Takaezu that's very subtle, that also requires manual manipulation, obviously. The third character, Edith Heath, here on the far left, who is with several other leading artists of the time at a conference in Asilomar, California, in 1957. Edith Heath is again, I'd say, fascinating because she's usually divorced from her craftsmanship and seen purely in terms of design. So much so that an exhibition just 5 years ago said Edith Heath never knew Margaret Wildenhain, but how interesting to put their work together. And you can just Google this image and you're like, well, they didn't know each other. It's not so strange. So it's really us in our own time period that separates these ideas into art, craft, and design. She is born in Iowa to Danish parents, Danish immigrants. She goes to Chicago. She trains at the Teachers College there, and then attends the School of the Art Institute. In 1946, she exhibits work at the Legion of Honor when she's living in San Francisco. And she's approached at that time by a buyer for a Gumps, a department store. And so 2 years later, she is happily employing 4 apprentices and producing pieces in a factory. And she's having a new factory built for her in Sausalito. She does this with her husband, Brian Heath, and he and she are really collaborators for their entire lifetimes. And by 1949, she's producing 100,000 pieces of pottery a year. And here she is at the wheel. Here is her factory in Sausalito. In many ways, she's magical, of course, because something that she started in 1948 and a design she made in 1949 are still going today and going strong. So this factory was purchased by a couple of young designers who had been working for Nike branding campaigns and really wanted manual satisfaction and in their lives and in their jobs, and they purchased Heath, but they're still maintaining her designs. The factory itself is something of a work of art and worth visiting, and really defines Edith Heath as a visionary in my mind, because she produced a factory in which every worker would have a window. She produced a factory in which there was a central garden. It really was this notion of a kind of manufacturing facility as a kind of modern utopia. And that was really quite strange and unique at the time for a woman to establish a ceramics factory in 1940s. Usually the previous time that it happened in America was really the late 19th century, where it was wealthy Americans who had done that. But Edith Heath was not wealthy. She did not come with from a bankroll here in terms of getting this work together or putting this factory together. And if you look at this image of Edith Heath's world, it is a kind of a screen made of ceramics, a bench made of ceramics, bird feeders made of ceramics. She's thinking through this material for her whole universe. So the factory is quite a remarkable place. Here is a kind of really close comparison. It's the closest comparison of one photograph with the same lighting that you can see on your left. A teapot that's thrown. It's got this very elaborate and somewhat strange Franz Bergmann silver handle. And then on the right is the design she makes for casting that same teapot and putting it into mass production. I know you hosted Chris Gustin here last year, and it's great to think of his family as the distributors of Heath ceramics and her ashtrays. And so the Gustin company down there, it's named bold, and her ashtrays. And if you look at photographs of any kind of international modernist interior offices, and Mad Men picks this up pretty well, there's always some kind of incredible accent piece of a kind of an ashtray. Many people find my devotion to the ashtray kind of somewhat heretical or toxic or obnoxious, but I think of it's one of the really interesting objects to look at because it's something that we're so puritanical about today in terms of our rejection of smoking. and seeing this as a kind of taboo object, when really all we're doing is teaching smokers to ash on the sidewalk and throw their butts with less etiquette and grace into the world. For Heath, the wheel, as I said, was not an escape from mechanization, but a spring that fed her production and the score of hands who were her team. And so this you can see in the exhibition on a wonderful green placemat, table mat, sets off the white. This is the coupe buffet line. This notion of the buffet and informal dining was really in vogue at the time. Karnes was doing it with her oven-to-tableware casseroles. And this low-slung handle, I think, is it's like a low rider or something. It's terrible for breakage, but it's wonderful and elegant for design. And I think it's really nice in the exhibition to see what Heath is by comparing her to Eva Zeisel, who's much more storied, much more legendary, much more celebrated, especially because of her association with the Museum of Modern Art. Zeisel's museum service was made with Elliot Noyes and Greta Walters at MoMA. It was not a solo show exhibited where they headlined Eva Zeisel at the time because no one in America knew who she was. She did have this incredible life. If you've ever read Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon, yes, about the Gulag in Russia, it really is pretty much a kind of novelization of Eva Zeisel's life, Eva Streicher then. She was in Berlin in the teens. Then she was in Soviet Russia, working and making ceramics then, and then she was all of a sudden considered a traitor in this kind of the lunacy of the Stalinist era, and imprisoned. When she came to America, she had the good fortune of landing with the Museum of Modern Art and teaming up with them to make the museum service. They exhibited it as modern China. And this notion of making a kind of an elaborate and exquisitely refined China tea set was foremost on the curator's minds. It was advertised then and is still celebrated as the first translucent china made in America. This notion, it was kind of patriotism, civic boosterism, the idea that these were made in America, and yet Zeisel made forms that were almost impossible for the factory to make because the teacup has no foot. It just terminates on the table. All of her creamers, they have no feet. The works that you will see in the show, works made a bit later, do have feet. Tomorrow's Classic and other forms were much easier for the factory to make, and so the factory could produce them without 50% loss as opposed to 85 or 90% loss, or 85 or 90% success rate, excuse me. But in this comparison, I find what's so exciting is that you really get to see the Museum of Modern Art selling what's supposedly within the reach of modern America, but really something that's quite old world, something that's really quite elite, and something that's extremely formal. And in comparison, in those same years, Edith Heath is making something that's much more for the American of the middle class world, as well as much more for a kind of American ethos. So these are really two different intellectual ideas about what products and production is. This might be hard to read, but it's, I wanted to show it to you because it's the Heath letterhead. It's got a little bit washed out here, but here she's writing a letter to Edgar Kaufman Jr., the legendary curator at the Museum of Modern Art, and she's talking about how they're settled at their new shop. She wants him to look at her work, and she's explaining how she's moved from throwing to jiggering and to using production tools. But the letterhead, of course, is celebrating that these are coming from the potter's wheel, in a sense. But she writes to him, I think we have managed, this is the third line down, we have managed to make use of mass production techniques without sacrificing the qualities of the handmade. And yet we are not imitating the handmade. And then she goes and launches into salesmanship. which is also something to learn from. But Heath is and then I also just note that she's crossed out hand-thrown dinnerware, as well as the advertisement, as well as her address down below, and then put in her new Sausalito factory. So it's a wonderful document showing her transition in thinking, and she's not throwing out hand-thrown pottery, and yet she's maintaining the use of the wheel. She even goes to Wedgwood in the 1960s, and she prototypes mass production for them on the wheel. One of the few Americans to do that. So if you journey to Sausalito, San Francisco, do take your trip across the bay and see the factory. And I hope what I've generated for you today is the kind of larger stories. I remember that sound. It's an eerie sound. Don't worry, Caroline, nothing's happening. It's a songbird of Alfred. These three alternative kind of biographical stories, I think, are ways to see the wheel in greater nuance. It's not the wheel versus handmade for Edith. For Toshiko Takaezu, the wheel does not lesser her art or her sculpture. It's still a tool to make sculpture. And for Karnes, the wheel is still her daily routine. It's her daily way of thinking and working through the world. These are fascinating lives to think through, so I encourage you to do that. But in some sense, I don't want to have the last word myself. I thought I would leave you with this sound so that you could decide for yourself whether it's an eerie sound, a productive sound, a threatening sound, exactly what sound was trying to be achieved. We have George Orr characterized as the mad potter of Biloxi, but we have never, ever characterized a woman as a mad potter, which begs the question of whether this is the woman problem or whether it's the wheel problem. It's another problem, real problem. But I would end with this question, which is, if the potter's wheel can be transgressive, why can't a woman working with this machine also be transgressive? Whoop, we've got robbed. Oh, technical difficulties. Wow. Sounds better. I don't crinkle my water bottle. But thank you. Questions. It's my favorite part of any talk. We can turn the lights on, I guess. Yes, Carol.
Do we have any words from Takaezu about this process of sealing and piece of clay?
The question was, do we have any descriptions by Takaezu in her own words of what she's doing? Yeah, she talks about them as poems that she wrote. She did actually start writing poems and then bundling them up in clay and throwing those in. But she's kind of, in terms of meaning, she kind of moves away from being absolutely, the interpreter of her own work. She usually demurs and says, that's for other people to say.
How did you prevent the rattle from fusing inside the pot?
That's a potter's question. I don't know, Sean? Someone? Anyone? There's dozens of you out there. There's only one of me.
There's a student who had worked with her, and it didn't come up directly, but another colleague of his that's in the program right now was trying to make a small rattle by putting little balls in
Thank you.
But there are wonderful tri-footed vessels made in Cahokia 1,000 years ago by Native Americans, which have rattles, or Veracruz, Mexico. So you don't need paper, presumably. You could use bark or something else, and it's interesting just to think of it as being this. It's not necessarily, it's something that can be innovative once and then innovative again in a different way and have an entirely different meaning, of course.
The interior doesn't necessarily have to be glazed. So if your ball is unglazed and the interior is unglazed, there's a chance that it's not going to stick. Particularly if you hit it a little bit, once you get it out of the kennel, it'll just be loosened. And it's also possible to, dip it in aluminum hydrate drop it in, which will resist any kind of sticking.
They must have known that in Cahokia.
I don't think the paper does anything.
What? Paper
I don't
doesn't.
think the paper could do anything.
Only if
It
it's.
would burn away much sooner.
Yeah. So no questions about transgressive behavior.
Those are philosophical
We're being-
questions. Like, how do you do the ball?
Yeah.
And so about Vulcus, to return to the question, problems surrounding Vulcus, you mentioned Vulcus. What do we know about the possible interactions between Vulcus and Heath and Karnes and Takaezu? What do we know about the statements each of these three women may or may not have made about Vulcus? What did they ever come out and say, oh, we're trying to, do innovative new things to play in a way that Vulcus didn't do? Do they see themselves, do you think, in opposition to Vulcus?
Toshiko Takaezu was very close with Peter Vulcus. They were friends. They had kind of terrible pet names, which I can't repeat because they really are unprintable. But they were friends, and I think she had a very strong sense of herself, though, in terms of making something that was a contribution. You have to be if you start throwing centering 30 pounds of clay when you're 75 years old and trying to make that Star Series. And as Linda said, Linda Sikora said she had the help of students. There's no way she made that work alone. So to think of her as different than Edith Heath in that way is kind of ludicrous because there were several students in Skidmore, right, who worked with her there and who helped her throw those pieces and helped her make them because she made the largest work of her life that was larger than she was when she was quite old. But I don't think, these people didn't criticize each other in that way. I mean, I don't know, in terms of, and Vulcus, like I said, he allowed his critical reception to go because he really wanted to, he wanted to make it. He wanted to exhibit it in New York City. He was, he wanted to be an artist. He had this kind of tempestuous relationship with, not wanting to be seen as a potter. That's pretty well documented. But he always, he never really, you can't really say he's one Vulcus. He's many different guys and he's many different people, and he had many different phases in his life, and he used the wheel quite a lot. So we never really rejected it.
So as a scholar, does it frustrate you that there's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy about his work? I mean, you kind of make it up ahead of time and then make sure that the work fills that? Or, this question of the wheel, I think is really interesting because is that the nexus of the revolution of the wheel, not the wheel? For Vulcus's entire career, he used the wheel. That was the main tool. Things were altered as he took them off the wheel.
Or cast in bronze, yeah.
Or later cast in bronze. But so he would stack wheel thrown forms and then add or cut or whatever. But the fundamental tool is the wheel. So as a scholar, it would seem quite frustrating to, bump up against this kind of really not a scholarly insight into the art.
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff I trimmed out. So one thing that's interesting to me, there's a lovely image of a blueprint for the Dandy Potter's Wheel in the show. It's on one of the labels, and it's drawn by Jane Van Alstyne, a graduate from Alfred, who also worked for General Motors and designed Frigidaires. If you actually pop her name into Google Patents, she comes up for refrigerators and parts and cars and this and that. So she designed that drawing with Susan Peterson, another graduate of Alfred. And buried in all the Volkos literature is the fact that Susan Peterson and her husband, whose name I'm not remembering right now, really had developed a new wheel that that allowed the kind of horsepower that Volkos needed to throw as big pieces. So the story of the kind of the electrification of the wheel in America is, it's interesting here in terms of Ted Randall and merchandising wheels, and it's also interesting in terms of then counter-revolutions, people going back to the treadle wheel, and so there's a lot in terms of technology which you could examine, and Volkos is I think what's most problematic really is the way that monetary value drives which narratives are told. So in some ways there's a self-fulfilling prophecy there, or correcting device where museums confirm the marketplace and marketplace confirms the museums. But that's more of the problem than wondering what Volkos' passion for the wheel, which gets lost. Because to see him as constantly using the wheel would be to see him as not being totally radical, right? So no one ever tells that story of how he used it. But I still want to know whether you think these women were transgressing decorum. Karen Karnes, strange gardens. Yes, Marion.
Sometime in the early to mid 1960s, there was a two-part television piece. The first part was on Volkos, and this is, again, the early 60s, and it shows him working on a large piece, and he was punching it and tearing it and making holes in it, and really the stuff was just flying all over the place. The second half was of Nikki de Saint-Phal, who had balloons filled with paint against the wall, and she was shooting them with a rifle, and the paint was splattering all over the place. And it made me think now that maybe the piece was showing that this woman could be as outrageous and as avant-garde as Volkos was being at that time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just don't think a woman working on the wheel would have made that spectacle that people needed to see in terms of defining what's avant-garde. But I think you're right. Yeah, there's nothing like firearms to make people believe in the avant-garde, because it actually goes back to the idea itself of the avant-garde being a military term. Any more questions? Well, ask me questions at the exhibition if you like. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk. Thank you.